Everyone. Good evening or good morning for those of you joining us from far away, and thank you very much for being here. My name is Monica Rivera. I am the Chair of Graduate Architecture here at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. And it is my pleasure to introduce this semester's first architecture faculty lecture by Professor Robert McCarter, who will be speaking about the architecture of Italian architect Carlo Scarpa. So thank you, Robert, for sharing with us this evening your expertise on Scarpa. But before I introduce Robert, I have a few reminders. First, I'd like to announce our upcoming online architecture lectures and panels for October. We will have the AIA St. Louis lecture by Deborah Burke, architect and Dean of the Yale School of Architecture. That is on Monday, October 26th at 6 p.m. And we also have an upcoming panel discussion as part of the Discussions in Architectural History and Theory series organized by Professors Igor Marjanovic and Eric Mumford about architectural history and diversity. We will have as guests Luis Carranza, Mario Gooden, Mary MacLeod, and Patricia Morton. And that is on Wednesday, October 28th at 11:30 a.m. So we welcome everyone to register and join these open events. And another quick reminder is that this lecture counts towards AIA continuing education credits. So if you're interested, please write in the chat AIA and your name, and we will contact you, get you those credits. And also at the end of this lecture, I will be moderating the questions and answers session. So I invite you to please write your questions in the chat box. It can be during the lecture or after, and I'll do my best to sort through and read the questions. So back to tonight's speaker. Professor McCarter is the Ruth and Norman Moore Professor of Architecture here at WashU since 2007. He has also taught at the University of Florida, at Columbia University, and other institutions. And during his 35 years in academia, McCarter has always taught a design studio and seminars every semester. And in 2009, he was selected as one of the 10 best architecture teachers in the US by Architect magazine. He's also a practicing architect and has had his own practice since 1982 in New York, in Florida, and St. Louis, with many completed buildings. And McCarter is also the author of 23 published books to date, including The Space Within, Interior Experience as the Origin of Architecture, 2016, Understanding Architecture, a primer on architecture as experience, 2012, together with Giovanni Palasma, and also many books on the work of architects, such as Place Matters, the Architecture of W.G. Clark, that was published last year, and other monographs on Grafton architects that was published 2 years ago, on Marcel Breuer, 2016, Stephen Hall, another monograph on Aldo van Eyck, both from 2015, Alvar Aalto, 2014, Carlo Scarpa, 2013, Louis Kahn, 2005, and Frank Lloyd Wright on 97. So among other awards and honors, in the 2018 Venice Biennale of Architecture, curators Yvonne Farrell and Shili McNamara of Grafton Architects selected McCarter to participate, and he presented an exhibit entitled Free Space in Place, 4 Unrealized Modern Architectural Designs for Venice, Carlo Scarpa's Quattro Progetti per Venezia Revisited. So please join me in welcoming Robert McCarter.
Thank you very much. I'm going to make an effort to share my screen. Are you seeing that?
Yes, you need to press the full screen. So the little icon at the bottom next to the 4 dots.
Right, I just need to get the slideshow started.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, now can you see everything?
Yes, we see everything.
Okay, thank you Monica, thank you for that kind introduction and also for doing the hosting duties, which is a lot more than just standing up in front of a room and introducing somebody with this technology. So this is the first of a series of 4 lectures this semester, and we hope to have some more next semester by faculty who teach here at Washington University and give these lectures. I don't know that I haven't given the Scarpa lecture maybe 15 times over the last 10 or 15 years at different institutions, but never have had the opportunity to give this particular lecture here, even in the context of a class. So I'm going to attempt to give an overview of Scarpa, touching on at the beginning some general things, and then coming, if we have time at the end, also for some general thoughts, and looking at a selection of 6 or 8 buildings in some depth, and then others just touched on to give a sense of his whole career. Carlo Scarpa was a unique figure among second generation modern architects because he was embedded in the archaic and anachronistic culture of Venice, while at the same time it could be said he was transforming the city by weaving modern spatial concepts into its fabric throughout his career. To a degree that's unmatched by any other modern architect, Scarpa stood in 2 worlds, the ancient and the modern, the particular historical place, and the larger contemporary world. His work joined these 2 worlds, and in so doing, he redefined preservation and restoration through works that integrate, engage, and transform place. 2 issues are key, at least 2, to his thinking. One is the place of time and the place of rituals of everyday life and how they act to inextricably intertwine past, present, and future in the building. And the place of the detail, the condensation of a boundless whole into a precise part, the articulate joint. And then overarching is the notion that architecture is determined and shaped by the experience of the inhabitant as someone who dwells in a particular place at a particular time. Oh dear, this is not. All right. Sorry, jumping ahead. Carlo Alberto Scarpa was born in 1906 in Venice, but the family moved to Vicenza in 1908. And Vicenza is the city that he spent the next 5 years of his life in growing up. And of course, it's the city of Palladio. And you see the main square is defined by Palladio's Basilica. And it's also at the other end of the Corso Palladio, as it's now called, is the Teatro Olimpico, which is the longest continuously enclosed space of theater in the world. And also just outside the city, of course, Villa Rotonda. And he will return late in his career to take up his office and residence in Vicenza near the Villa Rotonda. At the age of 13, Scarpa's mother died, and they moved back to Venice, where his father was a teacher. That's in 1919. And at the risk of oversimplifying, I would say that perhaps there are a few images that might help us to understand the magic of Venice. There's Vittorio Carpaccio's Miracle of the True Cross, 1494, that you see on the left. What's interesting about this image is that at first glance, it appears that a good number of the citizens are actually standing in the water, which they either are literally by being in the boats or crossing the bridge, or perhaps close by on the fondamenta. On the upper right is a typical canal, and it also typifies the idea that in Venice, the ground is the water and the water is the ground, and they're exchangeable. Also, the way the light is bounced up off the water as much as it comes down from the sky. And then an image of the Doge's Palace, which may now be a historical image, we shall see, but in Acqua Alta with that portion of Piazza San Marco in Acqua Alta. But it looks actually quite suitable given the sort of lightning from the solid top down to the lightning bottom. I mentioned that it could be historical because of the successful recent test 3 weeks ago of the Acqua Alta dam walls that actually successfully stopped a high water for the first time since they were completed a year ago. So it seems that that mechanism may work. A building that I think was particularly close to Scarpa's own heart for a number of reasons is Pietro Lombardo's Santa Maria dei Miracoli of 1489, which on the interior has a series of walls made of book-matched marbles, which of course emphasizes the thinness and the fact that it's cut and then folded open, which is where the name book match comes from. The building also uses on the outside even more prune stones, Istrian stone, and it's one of the first buildings where glass was used. It's this circular bottle glass, you could say, that's used to make windows. And as Adrian Stokes says, that glass shines with the very translucence of water. And Stokes goes on to say, in Venice, light and shade are recorded, abstracted, intensified, solidified. Matter is dramatized in stone, end quote. In 1926, having entered school at age 14, Scarpa graduated from the Royal Academy of Fine Arts with a degree in drawing. And he actually began teaching immediately, not at the Fine Arts School, but at the newly opened Istituto Universitario di Architettura Venezia, which is the IUAV, which has been in existence since 1926. So he began teaching, and that is the architecture school of the University of Venice. But he also started in 1926 a kind of, well, it originally was his only career and then became a kind of parallel career, which is his work in the Murano glass factories, first with Capelline from 1926 to 31. And this is a photo in the upper left of the Capelline glass factory around the 20s. And then Vanini starting in 32 and then going on to 47. And I'm going to show you a few examples because particularly when he worked with Vanini, Scarpa engaged, there were two modes. There were certain ways of making glass that he, of course, learned, but he also, and with Vanini particularly, they began to explore certain lost techniques. That is, they had examples, particularly dating back to Rome, of certain techniques of glass, but people no longer knew how to fabricate them. And so they tried to recreate the possibility of making some of these techniques. So in this image, the central bottom image is one of those, which is uses a series of cold tesseres. It's called murine opaque, and it's a Roman technique that was revived. This is a single piece, not in production. Actually, you can see it was broken. It belongs to the Vanini family. It's a somewhat experimental piece, but it's cold slices of glass rods that are then assembled and then fused. And then the other techniques, some of them are techniques that were known, like incalmo, which is the two-color piece where you have two pieces of glass, and I have absolutely no idea how this is done, but they were joined together to make a single globe. And in this case, it's also hammered, or so battuti, or ground. And then there's an early piece from Capelline, the black red with oxidized silver. And there's also a sommerso, which has bubbles in it in the lower left, which is submerged in crystal after the original piece is finished. Some other examples, the tessuto ribbon glass, which is actually pieces are still in production today. The inciso, which is a grinding, which you can see in the diagonal corners, two variations of the grinding. And then the murine, one of the bowls that are made from using the tesserae. And then finally, in the upper left, a technique he invented quite a number of techniques, but this one was particularly unique. It's called pennellate. It's a brush stroke, which he called marks of torn color, where while the vase was still hot, that you would drag around thin rods of glass that would almost act as paintbrushes and melt into the bowl as it's being rotated. And then some battuti's ground glass. And on the lower right is a one-of-a-kind piece, Murine piece from 1951, made in the 30s. But and I have it here because in 1951, when Frank Lloyd Wright came to Venice as part of his world exhibition that was touring, it was actually not on display in Venice, it was on display in Florence. But he came to the city and was given the key to the city. And he met Scarpa, who had actually come to meet him in the United States a couple of years before that. And Scarpa accompanied him along with Bruno Zevi as they walked around Venice. And they went to the showroom of Venini on Murano, and Frank Lloyd Wright saw this vase that's below him in the image here on the lower right, and he asked to buy it, and they said it wasn't available because it was a one of a kind and belonged to the family. And he said that he didn't care how much it cost, he would want to buy it, and they refused. And so the story is, which I recently had confirmed by finding the purchase ticket, he said, quite agitated, so which ones can I buy? And they showed him a case, and Scarpa the whole time was standing behind him, not saying a word. And he pointed to 6 vases. He bought 12 of 2 of them, and then single pieces of the others. And every single one he pointed to was designed by Scarpa, as was the one that's below him, which recently was toured and was able to be seen in the United States. It hasn't been out of Italy for many years. In terms of this learning from the craft of the city, you could argue that glass might be the first material after perhaps water that Scarpa fully engaged in his work. And it goes to his thinking about making, and it's very inspired by Giambattista Vico and his statement verum ipsum factum, which we will see that he later puts on the diplomas of the IUAB when he's the dean. He translates that as, we can only know that which we and other kind have made. That's a sort of long translation Vico makes. But Scarpa's translation has more to do, we can only know what we make, and we can only learn from what we make. It's a kind of idea of combining a notion of a material culture and a material imagination, in the sense of Gaston Bachelard's use of that term. And I think the glass is the beginning of Scarpa's simultaneous engagement of Venetian culture, a very old historic culture, which is also quite international because it mixes cultures from all over the world, and international modernism, which we see in the glass, but we will also see in his architecture emerging. And Scarpa's relationship to history and to the history of architecture is actually quite complex. And I think it might have a relationship to a statement by Joshua Reynolds of 1797, quote, "Invention is a new combination of those images that have previously gathered and deposited in the memory. Nothing comes from nothing. The architect who has laid up no materials in his memory can produce no combinations," end quote. One of his first projects, which had 2 phases, it was built first in 1935 to 37. I have a photo in the upper left is the first version. This is the aula magna of the Ca' Foscari, which is the economics. It's the palazzo that was taken over as the economics school of the University of Venice. And what's very interesting about the upper left image is the first time that in glazing windows in Venice, generally one just worked behind the existing window and replicated it with the new frames that were either set within the stone or slightly behind it. Scarpa proposes actually quite a different idea, that there's a completely different pattern happening in this new layer behind than in the fore pattern. And where the pattern on the exterior is heavy at the top, the pattern inside is heavy at the bottom. And of course, the pattern inside is also a much more modern pattern. The elements don't line up, the verticals don't line up, and they have different dimensions. Scarpa was asked to come back into this room and change the opposite side that we don't see in the upper left photograph, to put a passageway in that would allow the room to be used even when people needed to pass back and forth to other parts of the school. That was in 1955 and 56. And here you can see Frank Lloyd Wright's influence, if you know the split beam roof trusses of Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin North drafting room of the 30s. And of course, again, they first met and he was introduced to Wright formally in the 50s, but and that's exactly the time period, 50, 51, 52 is when this project was done. And other projects that probably show a similar, well, we can denote similar kinds of influence of Wright in Scarpa's work is the work he does at the Biennale, particularly in this book pavilion of 1950 to 52, He also did the entry to the Italian pavilion, as it was called in, and then the courtyard inside the Italian pavilion. So this is the courtyard. Here I'd like to quote Villa-le-Duc from his Entretiens of 1872, quote, "We must endeavor to proceed like the Greeks. They invented nothing, but they transformed everything," end quote. For some of you, that may sound somewhat familiar, because Álvaro Siza, a great Portuguese architect, has recently paraphrased that as architects don't invent anything, they transform reality. So all good ideas. So just before launching into his work in earnest, I want to talk a little bit about his drawings and the architect's way of seeing them. The upper left is at the Scarpa archives in Treviso. Two of my colleagues from the University of Florida having a look over the drawings. And we'll come back to some of the drawings they're looking at. With Scarpa, the design process is completely bound up with and literally consumed by the act of making. Decisions regarding the materials and craft and discoveries that are made actually during construction are recorded. Each drawing is a kind of self-referential archive, usually done on heavy cardboard so that it can be repeatedly come back to and changed and modified. It's not a linear record, but it's kind of enfolded and layered on itself, as you can look at the drawings around the edges of the main plans here in these two drawings. So the design process is somewhat embedded and inlaid in the finish construction, but also in the drawing that actually is paralleling the construction process. Because I don't think there are any drawings that we could call a construction drawing in the Scarpa archives in the formal sense, because he lived on most of the construction sites, and decisions were made with these drawings on the site with the contractor. So it's a combination of, in his drawings, you see a combination of corporeal imagination. You often see the body of the inhabitant as a scaling element, but also as something that gives a personality to the space. You have a sense of the nearness of things, sensorial richness, particularly the floor pattern in the upper right, and the notion of conception and construction as unified, as a single concept. And we'll come back to drawings at the very end. His first major project was a renovation of the Gallery d'Accademia, which is the most important art gallery in Venice. And it began in 1945, actually, during the period in which the paintings had been put in storage because of the Allied bombings of Venice and other Italian cities. And they were brought out, and because of the buildings had been somewhat damaged, there was a chance to renovate the entire gallery within its existing buildings. It takes place in 3 different buildings, which have been stitched together. There's Santa Maria della Carità, which is almost Gothic church, and then there's a convent designed by Palladio with a very beautiful stair, and then there's the scuola, which is usually attached to a church or a monastery. It's a traditional Venetian space. And so now you get to also see if you can discern my drawings from Scarpa's drawings. I hope you can, but anyway. I'm going to introduce you to certain ideas in each of these spaces, but I want you to also, because you're all architects and designers, I want you to look and think and draw some conclusions from the visual information as well. So the first room you enter, you come through the doorway in the upper left, which is a sort of slightly canted box that has an indoor and an outdoor, and is really one of the most amazing little puzzle pieces that you can imagine. And then you come up into the first major room of the scuola. And here is Scarpa's idea that you have a dialogue with art. So this is set up so that you can't see all the paintings at any one time. You actually can come quite close to them, but when you come close to one set, you are blocked from seeing the others, or you'd have to at least turn around. And this is his idea that each painting actually has its own space, and you enter that space and enter a dialogue with this art, whether it's from a seated position or standing position, depending. And in this case, it's standing because there are no real options of where to sit except a few small places near the window. There's a series of drawings and photos having to do with the amazing transitions that happen in this building. Because it's 3 different buildings put together, there's a series of places where a few sets of stairs are needed to move from one of these existing buildings to another, which before the museum was put there was not, they weren't connected. And of course, those give you vestibules that kind of prepare you for the next room, you could say, because it is intended to be a one-way sequence. This is the small masterpiece room, which is a room that has the smallest pieces in the collection and arguably some of the most important small pieces. But in Scarpa's mind, it was the room was still too large, and so he finds a way to subdivide the room and make, again, sub-rooms within. So he allows the room to continue in the walls and the ceiling, but he puts the panel up that divides it into spaces where you're blocked from seeing other paintings. And again, each painting is given its own kind of recessed position, its own background color, etc. And then on the top floor, there are 2 fantastic rooms. On the left is the Venetian scenes by Bellini, Mansueto, Canaletto, and Guardi. Views of the spaces of Venice that you've been walking through while you're there, now in use, or in use in the way that they were originally intended to be, through festivals and other events. And then on the right is the room that has the great Carpaccio cycle, the cycle of the legend of Saint Ursula that traces Saint Ursula from her birth to her death. And we'll come back to that room a little later. Scarpa's early work is often, if not exclusively, engaged in art, including many temporary exhibitions, and he would do that throughout his life. He was heavily involved with the Venice Biennale in some capacity as a designer for the art biennales, and almost every year, and sometimes also many exhibitions in the Triennale and others having to do with the glass from the companies he was working with. This is an exhibition that he put together himself that has 18 pieces by Paul Klee, which is 1948, so it's only a few years after Klee passed. And it's a small space that's been carved out of one of the other rooms at the Biennale, and he designed the ceiling, the walls, and everything except the floor. And he used Joffnet folded, which is the upper right painting, as a sort of thought about how the panels would work. So these panels are to some degree folded. His introduction of something different is, you can see in the upper left, he also introduces these column-like elements, which are made out of scrap pieces of wood from the gondola makers, the hardwood pieces that the gondolas are made out of. And so he recycles the scrap pieces of various kinds of colorful wood. Scarpa says that the impact of being able to spend several months looking at these 18 pieces very carefully, you can see many of them are quite small, and deciding how to position them in the room was one of the most informative learning experiences of his life about space and moving through space, sequence, scale, all the things that, of course, Klee was interested in, that he shared with his students at the Bauhaus and others. Another museum is the Correr Museum, Renovations, which is 2 floors that are on the south side of the Piazza San Marco. And one is a historical floor, and then one is the paintings floor. And I have some images from the art exhibitions here. This is, I would mention in the, particularly the lower right, this is the first time he employed what would become a quite typical thing in his art installments or complete renovations of buildings, which is the use of the easel. And what he felt was important about the easel was 2 things. One is the easel allows the painting to actually become an individual that you can address. Obviously, you can see from this photo that you can also position it to receive light in a certain way. In this case, sort of very strong side light, so you get a real sense of it. And then, of course, you can look at that painting, and then you can look at the painting on the far back wall and compare them, but you won't be able to see the other painting, which is facing away from you. All these rooms are very specific to the pieces that are in them. There's the sort of Gothic sculpture in the middle lower, which is separated from the so-called modern sculpture, which is on the other side of that frosted glass. But you actually progress down this hall and come back, so you'll enter this room twice. with two different kinds of sculpture. And then there's the room for the Sisters by Carpaccio, upper left, and Tonello Damascena's paintings on the right. And you see one, they both have new walls to help change the scale of the space, which are clearly pulled away from the existing walls or added to them. And one though is made of travertine and one is made of plaster and wood. Another museum from the same time period, 1953 to 54, is the renovations of the Palazzo Abitalis in Sicily at Palermo. This was bombed quite heavily during the war, and a good part of the building had to be rebuilt. But this is the National Gallery of Sicily, very strong in the work of Laurana and also Antonella Damascena. You can see the Laurana sculpture on the upper left is sitting on the multicolored wood stand, which again is made from recycled gondola wood, even though he's not working in Venice. And then probably the masterpiece of the collection is Damascena's Madonna in the lower right. And you can see she's attended by these three saints, and the three saints are on pivoting positions. You can see actually they're at slightly different angles. This is so that they can be adjusted to make the best of the light as it comes in from behind you where the photograph is taken. And it can be moved at different times of the day to avoid reflections and other things. But so the three saints are actually in some ways moving around as they attend the Madonna, who doesn't move, though she does look like she could. She's in the middle of the room. The next major project that I want to talk about is the Gipsoteca Canoviana. And this is a plaster gallery for the working plasters of the sculptor Antonio Canova, who was probably the most famous sculptor in the world of the 1800s. It's built in Bolzano, which is his hometown, and in fact is built as an addition onto an addition to his own studio. And so the largest part of this complex is pre-existing all the way back to Canova, but then more recently there was this basilica that was added. So the upper left drawing is actually not a drawing, it's just a photograph we have of a drawing, it's all that's left. But the upper right portion of that is a perspective from across the valley, because this is quite mountainous. This is in the Veneto, but it's at the edge of the mountains, so, excuse me. And what you can see is that in the upper right of that little sketch is a little dark window, and that's actually the window of Canova's studio that you see on the right, or you can see a piece of one of those big windows. So he has three very large windows that are pushed up to the top of the ceiling, and then small windows that allow light to the small drawing table you see on the right-hand side. The process here is that sculptures were first made as plasters here, and when they were achieved the right resolution, they would be actually shipped to Rome, which is where the real marble work was done by Canova. Canova had really quite a workshop, and they would be chiseled down to within about 1/16 of an inch of the final finish by his assistants, and then he would come to Rome and apply this famous finish that people thought looked really like excuse me, like human skin. It has a sort of translucence that's just really remarkable. But the sort of tricky part is that the plasters then have to be, information from the plasters has to be transferred to the marble blocks, and that's done through a series of little black pins that are put into, which you can see if you look as we go through the museum, that were put into the plasters that help them, by using calipers, they could make the transfer to the stone block as it was slowly shaped. So the two things you see in the upper drawing are the basilica, which is put on in 1836 by another architect, which holds plasters, and then he was commissioned to do an addition to that to hold more plasters. So in the upper left is the first view that we get through Scarpa's new entry space, and then you're seeing into the basilica, which, by the way, when he was hired to do the project, the basilica was painted dark gray inside, and he insisted on it being repainted white because that was the color he was also going to do for the rest of the galleries. He has his argument for that, which has to do with the fact that the white plasters are completely dead when seen against a gray or black wall, but they actually come alive when they're when they're seen against a white wall of a different surface or a different substance. The floors are, everything is white, but maybe you could say shades of white. A closetto marble for the floor and the small stair that goes up into the room. The I-beam columns are painted white, as well as the beams and the columns. The columns, by the way, rotate. That is that the sort of open space of the column rotates at each, from one position to the other, which is what he learned from visiting the Maison de Verre in Paris. The outer walls are rough, are literally thrown plaster, which means the plaster is thrown against the wall. The inner walls are rough white plaster, which is scraped with the trowel, but still has quite a rough finish. And then as one moves into the space, you become aware of a tall space, which I'll come back to later. Then you turn left and go down towards the Three Graces, and then you find that they are, behind them is Pietra Terrena, which is Venetian stone, again a shade of white. What you might notice is that, especially in the right-hand image, that's the same stone is carried from inside to outside through the glass, and you see that the inside stone is unweathered, but the outside stone, at least at certain moments when that photograph was taken, is basically black with weathering. So you're very aware of the inside-outside line, and made more aware by the fact the same material is carried through. But even to the point where he couldn't get glass sheets big enough to go all the way up past the floor line that you see at the end on the right, and he overlapped the glass like shingles, and then he actually sanded the glass joint off at an angle to make the glass joint even more pronounced, but he didn't want the color of the glass, he wanted the whiteness that you get with the sanded glass. And then of course there's the black steel stands for the small clay sculptures, which are the early studies, and then the wooden frames and the glass. And then we're coming back up and then up into the main room where, I don't know if you saw the news, but recently someone decided to sit on one of these sculptures and broke their toes off. These are plaster, so they're not really as strong as a marble would be, but I don't know if that's a good idea under any circumstances. But this room is lit in quite a remarkable way. It's very tall. It's taller than it is wide. It's a square in plan. And it has these 4 windows that, 2, you could say, that come in, so they're innies, and then 2 that go out. So, and the 2 that come in are a bit more heavily framed, and the 2 that go out are actually, where they appear to be almost not framed at all. And I showed the image up because when the building was opened, Scarpa said there was a very fine blue sky, and the sky looked as though it had been sliced into blocks. So the plasters have pins in them for shape transfer, as I mentioned. And what's important to Scarpa here is that this is a place not to show the final marbles, because there are no marbles here. This is all, these are all the working plasters, which normally perhaps might have been destroyed, but were kept, luckily. So that this is really close to Scarpa's heart in the sense this is about how it's made. It's not the final product, it's the process on the way to making. So you could say these are working models, like working drawings. So perhaps it's not so unusual to imagine that there would be a relationship, though it hasn't been pointed out very often, to my knowledge, between the studio on the right and the gallery, the main gallery on the lower left. They're related in terms of their dimensions and their proportions, and that being Palladian proportions, so that the original studio, and they're also diagonally at opposite ends of the whole complex. One is at the top on the right-hand side if you're looking across the valley, and one's at the lower left. And as you can see, my drawings on the left, the room has Palladian dimensions. It's 24 by 18 by 18 tall. So it has a square section. And if you were to take that room, that studio that he worked in, and tilt it up on its end, you would have the main gallery, which is 18 by 18 by 24 feet tall. And he also plays with the idea of the studio having the windows in the center of each elevation, very large, pushed smack up against the ceiling, which is quite unusual, but as you can see, it's right up against the ceiling. In his case, he takes that idea of the windows being at the ceiling, but he moves them to the corner, and they actually excavate or project out and in from the corners. So Olivetti showroom of 1957-58 on Piazza San Marco. This is a cross on the other side. so it's on the north side, and it gets the south sun. In the bottom arcade, Olivetti had asked for this showroom, which I'm not sure was ever intended to really sell anything. It was meant to be what he called a calling card for Olivetti as a company on San Marco, because it was one of the most important design companies in the world at that time. It has, as you can tell, this is a plan. This is, again, the only plan we have that Scarpa drew, which shows the fixed columns that he had to deal with. It has barely enough space for 2 floors if you have a quite low mezzanine above. So that was another problem. He had to reinforce the structure. He had to actually put more structure in the roof because it was not quite strong enough. In fact, everything about this is about limits. And he made a very strong argument that, you know, he feels that limitations give freedom. And if you don't have any limitations, you will not have any freedom. And he exaggerated that by saying, you know, I could have put the stair anywhere, but I chose to put it right in the middle, so that in fact it becomes a kind of a delete motif of the project. And the floor, which had to be raised, unfortunately wasn't quite raised enough, but it was raised at that time. They thought it was enough to get it out of the flooding of the piazza. He had to produce a new floor, and he used terrazzo, which is invented in Venice. It's a very ancient technique, but he used it used as the aggregate, you could say, quite unusual, the leftover glass paste that was left over in the mixing bowls in Murano for when at the end of the day, they have mixing bowls full of different colors and they can't really reuse them. So, but he told them to save them, let them cool, and then they would cut them up, and he used them, and they're hand placed. These little tiles are hand placed into the white matrix of the terrazzo. And then the stair, of course, it's rather astonishing. I don't know. I guess it could be a kind of Michelangelo's Laurentian Library meets some kind of de style composition, because it occupies the room, you could say, in a certain way, similar to the way Michelangelo's Laurentian Library stair occupies. And then upstairs, you get almost the opposite effect. You get a number of boat analogies, literally, because the mezzanines are hung and they don't touch the walls. And they're made of wood, and they creak when you walk on them, and they're quite thin, so they're actually literally made from boat detailing and boat logic. It's permanently moored, you could say, on the. And then at the end of the upper floor are these Vesica Pisces windows, which are fittings over the existing windows, which because it's on Piazza San Marco, the windows on the outside couldn't be changed, but you can change the interior sort of skin of it. And the Vesica Pisces, which we'll talk about a little later, is constructed by the intersection of 2 circles. But you also might note on the right-hand photo, the sort of boat-like brass detailing of the handrails, again, of the whole sort of mezzanine level. Related to that, kind of an interesting way, he was hired to do the Gavina furniture showroom in Bologna. And a very different city, a city of arcades and heat and massiveness. And again, he inherits a very strange space. You see the plan in the upper left. 4 of those columns are actually real structural columns that he had to keep, despite their very odd position. He just left them right exactly where they were. And then he put a 5th column in just to give himself some extra work to do, because that column he could do things with. So he cuts holes through it. Again, he uses here the multicolored wood of the gondola. You see the lower left, up in the sort of little office that's tucked up in there. There's a screen made from the multicolored wood of the gondola. And the tile work here is all done by his colleague Mario De Luigi, who will also be involved in a lot of his Venetian plaster colors at a later date. So here's the drawing that he did to show De Luigi how to do this back corner, which is under a skylight. And then I just want to mention another project from the same time period, the Manlio Capitolo Courtroom in Venice of 1955 to 57, which is made of all curved plywood. You see the yellow stained edges. I just recently visited this. It's been recently renovated, but it looks exactly the way it did originally. I don't know that I have time, but I could tell a quick story that in 1956, right when this was being completed, 56, 57, he was sued. Scarpa was sued by the Architects Association of Venice for practicing without a degree in architecture, which is true. He had a degree in architectural drawing, though he'd been teaching as a professor for 25 years in the architecture school and would later be the dean. But nevertheless, they sued him. And as it happens, the trial took place in this room. And the AI, or the Architects Association of Venice, architects lawyers, made the argument to the judge, who was sitting at the end of that little circular space that you see, that Scarpa was, not competent to make, architecture, because he didn't have the proper training, and he wasn't capable of making a good piece of architecture. And so the judge, of course, looked around and said, well, actually, I like it quite a lot, and I think you lose. So that kind of luck of choice of courtroom doesn't happen very often, but it's still the main courtroom, or one of the main courtrooms, where they try cases on a fairly regular basis in Venice. So the Castelvecchio Museum is something he worked on really for almost the entire second half of his life, from 1957 all the way through 75. And it has been worked on a little bit since then by his associate, Enrico Rudi. But it starts with the castle, which you see, the aerial, which is not the historical castle. This is as Scarpa has renovated it. But the castle was built by the Scaligeri to actually defend themselves against the citizens. So originally it was only closed towards the city, and the side to the river was open because the allies of the Scaligeri were on the north side of the river. And so that bridge was built as an escape route. And it really originally only came from inside the castle, and would provide an escape route. And then when the Napoleonic troops took over Verona in 1802, they actually built themselves a barracks across next to the river. So they you could say closed the courtyard. It didn't look exactly like what you see here in the lower slide, but that's the position of it. And they did that because they wanted to defend against the Austrians, who were on the north side of the river. And eventually, of course, the city of Verona got to take it over. And the first director of the museum, Avena, with the architect Forlati, they restored, so to speak, the whole project to a Renaissance style, including all the housing of the original Scaligeri family. And then the barrack courtyard, which has a series of square windows that you see across the bottom, that was completely replaced with windows that were taken, Venetian Gothic windows that were taken from buildings that had been destroyed in earlier floods in Verona. And the entry was originally at the center, where you see the three arches. And Scarpa would move, you can see in his drawing, his landscape drawing in the upper right, he would move the entry to the northeast originally, and then he moved it to the north, and he opened the northwest. So to the left he opened that space between the wall and the barracks, and then put the entry into the northeast corner. North is up here. And in their work, they discovered the original city gate as well as a moat, and both of those are exposed in So the Kangrande statue, which is the most important statue, arguably, in Verona, was moved from its original location to here, and there's a little story about that a little later. But and so it's in a vertical space in this sort of gap, that literally sort of a designed gap between the original city wall and the barracks, or the opened up barracks. And then sort of diagonally across from that is, that being vertical across from that is a kind of very horizontal entry, which is really a series of very, very beautiful horizontal layers. The walking plane on the left actually slowly slopes up. So you start slightly below the water and you end above the water that's in the pool on the right. So your sort of transition is super subtle, but you do notice, because of course the water maintains a perfect horizontal. And ahead of you, you're given two Roman pieces, a sundial and a tomb, that are made with the materials that the rest of the building will use, because Scarpa is trying to tap into the materials that have been in Verona forever, Verona stone and such. and then he shows us different ways of using it here at the entry with the small Sacelo, which is the sort of where the treasury, where the most small and most beautiful things are kept, which is a new building that projects out of the window. And then you see his use of those same stones that the Romans are using, but he's treating them differently and putting them into this kind of grid to make a kind of a stone cladding. These are 3/4 squares, which is a favorite motif that he will use, where you take a square and you just cut one corner out of it, and then you get this L shape that wraps around. And then the different finishes, of course, emphasize this. And I just point out there are 11 vertical rows of these. We'll come back to that as well. On the left is the entry, and then the exit is coming down to the left of that. And then in the center of the entry hall, there's the main passage accessway that you see across the lower galleries. And the floors that you see ahead of you are concrete floors. They have no bases. They do have a Istrian stone band running around the edges of them, and then or prune stone, excuse me. And then the floor is tamped. You're probably that's looking into the Sacelo on the right. And this is the first sculpture room. And again, the floor is concrete, but it's been tamped with boards. That is, while it's still wet, it's sort of tamped in parallel lines. So it's very hard material to try to figure out exactly what it is, because it looks like it could be a stone, and yet it's very large pieces. Around the edge of the room is a kind of trench. We're in Verona, where there is no Acqua Alta, but there is this kind of reference to Acqua Alta. And then these kind of irregular prune stone bands. Upper left is a take from a film that was made of Scarpa when the building was first opened. He's actually having a dialogue with that sculptor. And what he's explaining is that each sculpture is positioned in a different way, and they look at each other or at you or at the view. And you can see that in the right-hand image. I think all the different ways the light from the windows which is all coming really from the south side, how it affects each of the sculptures. And they're all standing on what I would call kind of water bases. They're Venetian plaster bases that are a kind of gray-green that reminds you of the color of the canals, at least normally. Now they're actually quite clear. But and so it's hard to see what the base stands on. It's actually quite impossible to see because they're so cantilevered from wherever their support is under there. And then, of course, the sculptures sit in a rather ambiguous way on this, what appears to be a shiny surface that shouldn't be able to take their weight. But the sculpture in the upper left is positioned there, which you're seeing in all three images, actually, that sculpture. So that the sculpture has its back to you when you come in the room. And Scarpa was asked, well, why? Of course, you should address the sculpture from the front, because that was how it was designed. And he said, no, if you look at the front, you'll never look at the back. And the best part of this sculpture is the back. And because of this incredible braid, which is the most detailed part of the whole sculpture by far, is this braid that runs down the back. And so he knows that you'll eventually go around and look at the face, as he's doing. But he wanted you to not miss that particular aspect, because it's what makes this sculpture unique. And this has to do with his individual approach to each piece, and its position, its height with respect to your view, and how it discourses with the other pieces in the room. So this is the central room where there was an original entry, and he's actually blocked it up with it. So you can go out through here and go out on the terrace, but it's no longer an entry. It is a part of it's a central room of the passageway that runs through. The walls are thrown plaster now on the inside, which means that the mason literally just took the wet plaster and threw it against the wall with some force, and and then it's not normally treated with trowels. That's often used on the exterior, but he's brought it inside to give a kind of a real texture to those walls, which then play against the upper right, the Venetian plaster walls. And then each of the sculptures are permanently fixed, and he designed their position, and that was part of what he was asked to do, was to reset the collection. And so he's sort of where the Christ figure, for instance, on the cross, he's recreating a kind of background cross that to allow that to be positioned so it's not just hung on the wall, it's actually freestanding. And you can also see in here that the ceiling is also changed. He had to lower the ceiling so he could improve the light of the upstairs room, and so he actually had to make a whole new set of floors on the upstairs, which makes whole ceiling. So it's new concrete beams that cross at the center and then are supported by steel. It's a rather strange structural system. So the center support is there, but it's given by an independent steel beam that runs down the center of the room and then has a rocker joint that reaches up to touch the piece. So this is the last room in the ground sequence, and this is where he opens a window in the floor and shows you the moat that was discovered during the construction, which they left open, which used to allow the water to come in from the river underneath and into the central moat space. And then when you go outside through that door, you get your first or your second view, I guess, a close-up view looking up at the Kangrande statue. And that's actually a view, when you come out of the door, you're getting the actual proper view, which we'll look at a bit later, of the Kangrande in its original situation. And then you go across and up a tower and into what was the family residence. And these are also used for smaller scale pieces of art, paintings mostly, and some sculpture. And it's a series of 2 floors of rooms. Then you come back out of that and walk across the top of the wall or through the wall, and then you come and have your third view actually eye to eye. You can see the Kangrande statue sort of from eye level. You can even walk out to the stand that he's placed on. And so you look at the way it's sitting on its base in the upper left image, for instance, seems quite strange, but what Scarpa's done is to actually go back and research. There are these drawings in the center by John Ruskin of this statue in its original position in the center of town. There is a statue there now, but it's a duplicate, and this is the original that's at Castelvecchio. And the angle of view and the sort of, it was designed to be seen from this low view from coming in the doorway here, and that close-up view gives you a particularly good sense of how it's not really designed for looking at straight eye level. It's distorted in order to look proper from below. So what you get when you come out of the back door next to the bell in the lower left image on the bottom is that exact angle, and also the proper height that you can see in the section of Richard Murphy's on the right. And then when you come into the upper gallery, which is on top of the gallery that you originally entered, you get on the upper right, on the left-hand side of that slide, you can see it's a little hard because it's overexposed, but you see a last look at the Kangrande statue. He's kind of looking at you through the window as you make your way down this sequence of spaces where the ceilings are all gray and the space is moving in and out because of the thickness of the wall of the river. And this is the floor that was lowered so that the light quality would be better on the paintings. And the very last room, which was the last room to be designed, has the most contemporary paintings in it. So he gives it a blue ceiling because the blue brings the color out of those paintings. And among those paintings is the Quattro Santi Camaldolesi by Gian Domenico Tiepolo. And in fact, we're not exactly sure who took this photograph, but Scarpa at some point had himself taken in a photograph with this, appearing to be experiencing the same moment of transcendence as the 4 saints that are in the painting. But Scarpa had an astonishing relationship to the art that he was involved with. I don't know that any architect has ever entered into that kind of relationship. And it was, and many projects. It was not just one time that he had this opportunity. So the next project is the Fondazione Querini Stampaglia, which is a renovation, a rather important renovation because the building was basically uninhabitable when he was hired in 1961. There's a main library, which was given by the family to the city, which is used as a library by mostly university students on the upper level, the Piano Nobile. And then the main lower level, which is necessary for entering, was mostly submerged because the water level had risen in the city and the building had sunk, so that he, within a rather restricted vertical territory, he had to figure out how to lift the floor, or at least get the floor dry. He also had to make a new entry. So the new entry was his very first idea that you see on the right, that normally you would have, unless you came in from the gondola entrance that you see on the left, you would have gone through this little tiny alley that you see on the far right of the drawing and entered into that checkered room, the square sort of dark checkered room. But that alley is less than a meter wide, so it's just not possible to turn and even make an entry into the, so he proposed to make a new bridge which would go across and come through a window. And that was his first idea. It was this last thing that was built. I'll show it to you now, but it was actually finished last because it took the mayor of Venice, who at that time was an architect, to overrule the preservation board and allow him to turn the window into a door. It's, the bridge itself is also, of course, a remarkable kind of echo of the typical bridge. You see one right next to it, the one that goes to the small alley. So it kind of, and it's made of both very traditional materials like the stone that comes off the piazza, but at the same time there's the wood. And there's double handrails. There's the one that you hold with your hand. There's the one that you lean on. Again, all of the details very much reminiscent of boats and of gondolas. Originally, you don't do it anymore, but originally you would have come through that entry, or unless you came through the gondola entrance, which I show flooded to the left, and entered into the room. And now you see how he's solved the problem, because what he's done is he's actually put a trench. So rather than keeping the water out, he's allowed the water to continue to come in, but he's basically trenched the floor so that the water can completely surround the floor. It's the most magical room that I've ever been in during Acqua Alta, because the sound and the light, the way it bounces off the water, which surrounds you, you're literally on a little island. And it completely takes over this end of the building, but all of the floors are still protected and habitable. The pattern on the floor, again, is a variation on the L shape. He did start with, as you can see in one of the only drawings we have on the lower left, he did start with the idea of taking one of Joseph Albers' glass pieces. It's called Bundled from 1925. It's a piece that Albers did at the Bauhaus, and he had literally sort of inscribed it into that room. Later he came and designed, this is his drawing to the right of that small Albers piece. This is his drawing showing the masons. So this is not a random project for the masons. They're told where to put each piece. There's only 4 colors, and the 2 shapes of the L shape and they make the L shape with this small corner taken out. I have spent hours in here looking for repeating patterns. There are no repeating patterns within any 4 tile set or 4 block set. Which is not easy to do. So there was a lot of work put into the notion that if one spends time here, there is a kind of constantly something to entertain you. There are other projects he did where the patterns do repeat, but in this case, in the Castelvecchio, he chooses not to. Among other things that needed to be done, the stair up to the library was quite deteriorated. So this is the stair that everyone uses to go up to the library. He didn't do any work above the library or above this floor level at the entry to the library. So this is the end of his work. But, and this stair has been studied a lot, and it's often drawn as if these new treads and risers could just be sort of lifted back off of the original stair. In fact, it's been drawn that way literally as a kind of exploded drawing, as if that was possible. But in fact, when he put particularly the new risers in, he cut the nose molding off of the old one, so that if you were to take the new tiles out or the new stones out, you would have there would be a scar in the old. So this, I would think, kind of comes very close to revealing Scarpa's notion that when you renovate something, when you put something new into something old, it's now completely joined, and it's not possible to go back to the old, but it's also not something that erases the old or replaces it completely. It's now actually joined physically, in this case, by sinking these new pieces into the notches made into the old pieces. And he plays with you because he shows you the nosing at the ends, and he shows you right in the middle a little piece of the nosing, but that's all that's left of it. So the rest is gone. So this is the old entry room. That's what it looks like when it doesn't have water in it on the right, which is not happening too much anymore. That is, the water level has risen so that it's almost always in the room. But you see you're walking on a kind of bridge. The water actually goes under this bridge. And at the end is a room he left on purpose so that you see the lower center photo, so that you could, this is a room that did not get raised. It has a new floor put in, but it was left at the original to show you the sort of level of the water typically as was happening, which is why he was hired to do the other. And so this you can see the level of the raised bridge. And then in the middle of this, facing the gondola entry, is the main aula, which has this rather fantastic container of black glass and stone, which holds 2 radiators. You would think it holds a bit more than that. And then this room, of course, has the markings. The floor is turned up as if the water would be able to come in. It doesn't come in this far, but there's the memory of the level of the trenching that carries right out into the garden, or into the front part of the garden. And then the walls above that are made of travertine, which is used in a vertical and horizontal way, and then with inset light, vertical lights. And then at the end on the right is this quite famous door. And I think he's treating the travertine as if it were some kind of cabinetry or wood. And so it is a bit shocking, but actually not quite as shocking as you might imagine, to find that this door can open, swings open to allow you into a small secondary space. And you come out into the garden, and the garden, like all Venetian gardens that want to have trees of any size, has to be raised. So it's raised up, and that's because the tree roots, if it's put in at the normal ground level, they'll go straight down into the salt water, and they will never grow to any size, so they won't survive. And you can see there's this kind of glass box on the right, how the garden and the room sort of interchange with each other around these existing columns that mark the edge of the building. And then there's a fountain, and then the fountain, the water comes from the fountain and it goes into this trench and goes down to the other end. The fountain, the lion at the other end, which we're seeing from above here, was found on the construction site, which is very typical of Scarpa. He just reuses it something, and so was the wellhead that you see that's no longer on the well, but there was originally a well here. And the water flows from the east to the west, because in Scarpa's mind, the culture of Venice is coming from the Orient, because of Venice's long history as the trading center that connects the east and the west, and that Venice learns from the east, in his opinion. You can also see here how he uses marble pieces on the corner of the concrete, and it somehow elevates the concrete so that it is still concrete, but now it somehow is somehow more honored. And I've shown some details of that in my sketches. And this is the view the other way. So you're looking back towards the source of the fountain, with the lion that straddles it. And then in the water system here returns to the deep pond that's underneath on the lower right, underneath this central fountain, which is actually recycled from a 1961 exhibit that he did in Turin. He just brought the copper fountain, it was about Venice and water, that exhibition. Okay. The Banco Popolare di Verona edition, which is very late, finished just as he died, 1973-78, which I worked on with his associate Arrigo Rudi. So here on the upper left, you see the original buildings that the bank had actually bought those buildings to tear down. They also wanted to tear down the building that you see in the lower right. There's a building kind of dividing this piazza into two. It actually is two piazzas. One on the left is for church, and the other on the right was a commercial one. And they wanted to tear it down so that the whole of his new addition would be visible. And he actually refused and said that that wasn't the right thing, that the piazzas needed to stay where they were, and that his building wasn't important enough to be able to be seen frontally. So it actually always has to be seen diagonally. And to some degree close up, at least, unless you want to see it completely diagonally from the corner. This is Arrigo Rudi, who was his associate who finished the project. So the facade is made of Botticini marble, which is cut. Also calcepesta stucco, which is using a brick dust. It has a kind of brick dust or terracotta dust. And then red Veronese stone, which is what's given the ziggurat or the sort of indented cuttings. It's an intensely layered facade. I would call your attention to the shadows made by the glass, which is really quite remarkable. That isn't always visible late afternoon. If you're not even counting the little small cuts, it's got a number of layers between the outermost layer and the innermost layer. It's really quite astonishing. These little ziggurats are 5.5 millimeters. 5.5 is half of 11. 11 will come up a lot. At the top, we have an inverted cornice. This is something he learned from buildings in Venice, that the dentils that are normally on the underside of the cornice are put on the top so that one has some kind of pattern to see against the color of the sky, which is really important at the top of the streets in Venice. So he's invented his own version of that. Then also the little double columns at the top, which, and a double beam on top of that. On the back is the courtyard facade, which is more private. It's the courtyard is owned because they own all these buildings which are connected together. And then it sort of erodes to produce the stair that you see on the right. And then on the left, it is a bridge projects out to connect to the other building that they bank owns across the way. Inside, this is the main working bank level that the public could have access to. It has a polished plaster hung ceiling, but you see how the structure is exposed. He turns down the beams of the concrete structure, so you see the board form concrete touching it. The double columns, which are cast into steel bases that are then slightly sunken into the floor. And then at the top, they're joined together by the bronze collars with the Muntz metal detail inside, and two Vesica Pisces, in this case, three-dimensional Vesica Pisces, spheres that are interlocking. On the far right, you see a little bit of onyx, which we'll see again, and then these kind of faceted columns, which are cast in board form, so they're a little bit like fluted, but it's just done with straight pieces. Then this is the stair that goes down to the employees' floor. It's a double stair that goes down to the place where the employees have their services, and then you go up to the executive floor. There you see the onyx again on the way up, and the sort of layering of the facade in the stair that you just see a little bit of in the central image. And then upstairs, again, polished plaster ceilings. In this case, columns are they have capitals that are actually up in the ceiling, so to speak, where the beams come down to touch them. So you have the red marmarino, you have the blue. These are the colors, and these colors were selected by Scarpa. He told Mario De Luigi to match the colors in a recent book that he had bought of the paintings of Mark Rothko, and they are in fact dead-on ringer matches for even to the point of the cloudiness of that is the sort of, I wouldn't say lack of inconsistency, or lack of consistency. I would say, anyway, just the sort of dark and light shades that happen with these, which of course cannot ever be properly captured by image. On the left, you see a typical executive office, which shows you what happens with those round windows, because they're just portals and behind them are square windows. So there's a game between the fixed square window, not unlike the windows that he made early on that we saw in Venice, where the original windows, in this case, they're all built at the same time, but it's a kind of suggestion of layers of history. And then this late stair, which was finished by Rudy, designed by Scarpa, but completely finished by Rudy, which has wooden walls that are then given the marmarino finish. So I show his cemetery last, not because it's chronologically last. He worked on it from 1969 to 77, but because I think, among other things, he is buried here. So, and it was the last project that he saw completed because the bank wasn't quite complete when he passed. This is in San Vito di Altivole, which is a little town in the Veneto, not on the water, but not too far from Asolo. And you see his early plan in the upper left. Basically, the family had bought a couple of family tombs, which are the notch that you can see that's taken out of the old cemetery, and they assumed he would design one of the traditional family tombs. And they purchased the land behind, the L-shaped land behind, in order to protect, because that's an agricultural field, and they just didn't want anything to be built there. So they thought they would buy it, and then they could just keep it as agricultural field, so that it would always, the space directly adjacent to the cemetery, which was, this is the size of the cemetery originally. It's gotten bigger since then. It's been added to towards the right. And of course, Scarpa, eventually after Brion passed, and he continued to work on the project, he expanded it and actually used that whole space. And the only piece, you walk from the existing city along the walkway, and you pass first this upper right. You get a peek at the cemetery from the outside, and then you go into the old cemetery, and then you enter into it. And the only piece he did design a family tomb, you could say, but it becomes the entry portico. So you enter through what would normally be one of these family tombs. So you, in a strange way, you enter the ground of burial. And two things happen. One is that he introduces you to another elevated ground plane, in this case, not for the reason of flooding, but just as a kind of memory of Venice, so that the whole upper level garden is lifted. So you have to walk up to that. And then there's another Vesica Piscis, this one with the two complete circles. It has tiles inlaid into the edge of it, and the blue on the right and pink on the left. So you have a new horizon line that you see through the Vesica Piscis window, a new elevated horizon line, at least with respect to the ground level of the existing cemetery. If you turn to the right, you go down through a glass door that sinks into the ground, and then or you push it down, you walk across it, and it comes back up by means of a pulley system that you're not aware of originally. And then you come to the family chapel, which this is an old photograph. It's recently been renovated, but it just stands out and gives you a view through a pair of eye openings, which this photo is taken a little below them, but those eye openings were set at the eye level of the widow, because by the time he was building this, she was still alive, but he had passed. And you're looking back over the tomb and towards the town and to the church, where most of us start our journey to come here. You come from the center of the town where that church is, which is and then you walk along the cemetery road, which is lined with cypress trees. There's probably not enough time to talk about all the things that happen here, but when you go back, I guess what you might recognize is that on the outside, the right ring is still blue and the left ring is still pink, so that they reverse. So each ring of this entry gate, though you can step through it, it's inviting to do so, but each side actually has both blue and red. So he constantly a reference to both male and female, husband and wife, in many cases. And of course the greatest is the arc that he puts over the tombs, and the tombs are sunken into the ground, or they appear to be. Actually, they are standing back on the original ground level of the surrounding territory, but from the reference point of this elevated ground plane, they seem to be partly buried. And then the two tombs are inclined towards each other in perpetuity, as if they have a curved bottom, as if they could rock, but they are quite fixed. And he made the comment that the intention here was that the two people who were so close in life that they would be able to greet one another, or they're reaching to greet one another after death. Across the way is the family tomb for the children and other cousins and others, which is a separate building, sort of built right into the edge of the battered wall that makes the new horizon. There is an alternate way to get in, because they intended that the chapel would be used by them, but also could be used by anyone who was having a burial ceremony in the main cemetery. So there's this pathway that you see on the left that's coming up is from the outside. There's a gate that you see on the lower right that you can open and roll open, concrete gate, and go up. But you can also get here in the upper right by coming through the passage from the family cemetery and the tombs that you see at the end. And then you swing open this enormous concrete door that he calls the Mondrian door. It's steel with concrete and then a white plaster finish. Opens surprisingly easily, and then come into the small chapel. And there's a font which has, again, Vesica Piscis as both the operating mechanism and the shape of the opening. And then you come into the chapel, which is rotated 45 degrees with respect to the geometry of the whole. And there's a place in the center of the floor where the small tiles, which are quite beautiful, give way to a marble floor, which is exactly the size of a casket that you would put there in front of this altar. And then behind the altar are, you can see in the upper right, are a pair of windows low down near the water, which can be opened. You see in the lower left to let light bounce off of because this room, one finds out, is almost entirely surrounded by water. And you can also see what I call the sort of submerged ruins. You exit through the door on the upper right to go out to the Cypress Garden. This view is from the Cypress Garden looking back. The Cypress Garden has spaces for 20 trees, but it has only 11 trees, as if some were never placed, or perhaps they were there once and are now gone, but there have always only been 11 trees. And then you see a detail a bit more of the light and the window and how it bounces up. This was one of Scarpa's favorite projects, he said, because it was a cemetery where people feel that they could come with their family and the dogs could play and people could laugh, and that, in his opinion, cemeteries were not places of sadness, but places where those that have left us would wish us to be happy in their absence. So these are photos taken quite late in his life, because it was finished in '77 and he passed the next year. In November, or in late October 1978, Scarpa made a trip to Sendai, one of his many trips to Japan. He was quite fond of the Japanese culture. And you see him in the upper left, dressed in the traditional Japanese garb. And because when he was there, he tried to respect the traditions of the country. And so he sat at the table and partook in the typical domestic furnishings rather than sort of bring his Western way of working with him. The story has it that he was on the roof being shown a building by another architect at night, and he stepped back or slipped and fell down a set of roof stairs and hit his head and went into a coma. And he was in the hospital in Sendai for 11 days, alive but unable to speak. He could draw, but only write backwards. And so he made 11 small books for his friends. I have seen one of them that was given to one of my friends. And he lived for those 11 days, and then he died in November. So he died in the 11th month. So there's this rather astonishing connection between Scarpa and this number 11 that he chose to use as his leitmotif, in the sense that it was a dimensional thing. 11 centimeters was his standard dimension for everything, and or some multiples of it. And but also this notion of the double, the sort of two columns, two circles intersecting to make a Vesica Piscis. He asked to be buried standing up like a medieval warrior. So he is in fact under that small steel piece in the back. This is a tombstone designed by his son, Tobia, who did not do what Scarpa asked, because Scarpa asked his client and friend, Aldo Busanaro. This is a quote from him. He asked Busanaro, he read him this piece of the poem by Eugenio Montale, who's one of the great Venetian Veneto poets. And it's a poem called We Never Know How We Will Turn Out. And this is a portion of it. And then one day, these words with no sound that we derived from you, fed on weariness and silence, will come to a brotherly heart, well seasoned with the salt of Greece, end quote. And Scarpa said, when my time comes, cover me with these words, because I am a man of Byzantium who came to Venice by way of Greece. So if I have time, I just want to make a few more points. Despite the ever-increasing difficulties with Venetian preservation authorities who wanted historicist forms to be built new, Scarpa believed that Venice, quote, Venice more than any other Italian city can accept modern architectural designs because of its characteristics of asymmetry, varying building heights, tall and short, streets, narrow and wide, with beautiful internal spaces. So one of the sort of facts of that is his involvement with this project from the beginning, which was the Mazzieri Foundation, originally the Mazzieri House, but then when Mazzieri died, trying to visit Frank Lloyd Wright in the United States, it became the Mazzieri Foundation, which is part of the University of Venice. And he was involved with Wright and then later with the Mazzieri family in trying to carry forward the project. But he worked till the end of his life to try to see if this couldn't be, or for many, many years anyway, to see if it couldn't be realized. And this is Frank Lloyd Wright in Florence. And I'm showing you some images around the site. Other maybe less direct connections, but interesting connections, is that when Le Corbusier came in 1964 to work on the hospital that my studio is studying right now, he was taken to see, in the upper left, the Cornice Stampaglia, which had just recently been finished. And he was completely struck by this. And he said, "Qui est ce beau artisan?" Who is this great artisan who did this? Because he had no idea. And the same day he was taken to the Accademia, as many tourists are, and he was in the room of Saint Ursula, in that room in the upper right. And the funeral is actually the one, you pass it, when you come in the door, it's behind you, so to speak, so you come to it last. But he was completely struck by this, there's a detail of that image, of that painting by Carpaccio in the lower right, of how Saint Ursula is being elevated as she's walking into the church. And so this is where he immediately that same day, he drew this very interesting notion of how the patient would be at the top of the building and the patient would be actually elevated quite high off the floor. You see this kind of rather sad looking Corbusier man lying there. And I'm very aware at this moment that José Uberi, it seems to be on the line here. So, and then again, a connection with Scarpa, and in this case, a bit more direct, when Louis Kahn came to work on the Palazzo dei Congressi. And these are the buildings that Scarpa presented in the exhibition that Monica mentioned at the beginning, that I re-presented, so to speak, as part of the more recent Biennale. 1972, he presented these projects. And he visited Scarpa's house. This is actually a photo in Scarpa's house on the left in Asolo, I think. And that's Carlos Vollenrath, who was Kahn's associate on this project. And they're looking at a book of the work of Frank Lloyd Wright that was given to Scarpa by Wright when Wright was in Venice in 1952. And these are some images from, this project was on 2 different sites. And of course, Scarpa spent a lot of time trying to get this one also built, same time as the hospital, a couple of years later. And then lower left, just to let you know that some people who get a chance to lecture on the roof of the Doge's Palace, which is where he found out how to do the roof of the Kimball, because he studied the lead roofing of the Doge's Palace. And from 1968 to 78, Scarpa himself was given the commission for the Fondazione Mazzieri, the one that should have been on the site that Wright would have done it. You can see the little building in the upper left, but he was not allowed to change the building on the exterior. In fact, he believed there had been 2 chimneys, as you see, but there was only one when he took the commission. But he was told that he couldn't change the facade, and he said there was clearly used to be 2 chimneys, and they said, well, you can't put the second chimney pot back. So he went and found a painting by Canaletto, which showed this particular part of the Grand Canal. because this is just off the Grand Canal, and it shows the two chimneys. So he was allowed to put the two chimneys, which of course is another double. And now I'm going to wrap up with just a few thoughts. So there is this interest in the double, and the way the double actually also produces a third, in the case of the Vesica Pisces, a kind of provocative third, which can be used alone or can be used in the full sense of the two circles explicit. But you see the lower right is one of his very earliest interior projects, and this notion of this double circle is there from the beginning. There's also this notion of squares being having a corner removed, either just literally to make the pattern of the squares and the L shapes, or as in the joint that you see in the center, this idea that he got actually from these craftspeople. The idea when you make an inside cut, you have to make two cuts. They almost never meet perfectly. So he said, why do we worry? We just drill a big hole where we want the two things to meet and just let them meet. And then we'll put something special into that hole to celebrate that hole. So in fact, all his interior corners are given this kind of a articulation. But again, it comes right out of the craft that it took to make it. There's also this notion of the, there's a number of things that happen here, but the double figure, but also the notion of the, if you look at this drawing, you see 11, 22, 33, 44, 55. These are all, of course, multiples of 11. These are dimensionings for a project in Brescia. And I would just mention again that the Vica is verum ipsum factum, which is truth is in the made, and we only know what we make, was put on the gate and the diplomas of the IUAV during the time that Scarpa was dean in 1972. Perhaps I just mentioned a thought of Paul Ricoeur's from 1961. There is a paradox: how to become modern and return to sources, how to revive an old dormant civilization and take part in universal civilization. The problem is not simply to repeat the past, but rather to take root in it in order to ceaselessly invent. One final major thought is that Scarpa revived actually a number of ancient Venetian ways of making glass and architecture, and almost single-handedly brought polished plaster back into contemporary use, and now it's used all over the world. He had great respect for craft people and either the work of the Zanon brothers, which they still have their shop in Venice. I visited them recently. The upper left pieces are all from the Zanon, or the woodworking of Signor Contini, who passed away just recently. On the lower right, you see them working together. They're drawing directly on the pieces of wood for pieces of furniture. So that the drawing is actually, in this case, just markings on the wood that would then be cut. I think it's important to mention, this is Scarpa at work in his studio in the Valmarano Villa. Quote, this is Scarpa: by restoration is not meant only repair work on old buildings. Our duty is rather to give them a new lease on life so that they may be able to live today and tomorrow. In my architecture, all the existing buildings form a part of my métier. So for Scarpa, renovation was not a sort of something that was separated from daily life. The notion of daily life, contemporary life being embedded into the city was a key element. I'm going to skip over some of these things and go straight to maybe, okay. So the last thing that Louis Kahn ever wrote for publication before his death in 1974 was a foreword to the book called Carlo Scarpa, Architecto Poeta. And this is Louis Kahn, 1974. In the work of Carlo Scarpa, beauty, the first sense; art, the first word; then wonder. And then the inner realization of form, the sense of the wholeness of inseparable elements. A work of art makes manifest the wholeness of the form, a symphony of the selected shapes of the elements. In the elements, the joint inspires ornament, which becomes its celebration. The detail is the adoration of nature. And then I just want to finish with this one drawing. And this is what Scarpa said about drawings. Quote, I want to see things. I don't trust anything else. I place things in front of me on the paper so that I can see them. I want to see, therefore I draw. I cannot see an image unless I draw it. I can only see an image if I draw it. Thank you very much. Let's see.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. Okay.
So that was a bit long, but I appreciate your attention.
Yes, so we're now going to open up to questions. So if you'd like to either maybe raise your hand and you can tell them yourselves, or you can put them in the chat box. I have already a question here that I'd like to read. It's by Keith Limo. Hope I'm saying his last name correctly. Yeah. Yes, would you, first saying, wonderful seeing your profound understanding of Scarpa. If you could please elaborate on drawings that you were speaking about just now, as a way of making, and also the tacit knowledge of Scarpa's eyes, hand, color, material, and space.
Well, that's a Keith Plumell question. And thank you, Keith. Well, you know, I should prefer to give a whole lecture on his drawings, because the problem is that, again, we're showing them in a way that doesn't allow you to approach them. I intentionally showed that image of my friends kind of leaning over, because there's a sense that they come to life. One thing to keep in mind is with a few exceptions, almost all of them are made on a kind of fairly thick cardboard, which almost you would think you would make a model from it, but and it has a really, really beautiful surface. And then there's the drawing, which is done usually very accurately, and then slowly it begins to be eroded by layer after layer of work directly on the actual plan. So it's built up of different colored pencils particularly, but then also many, many, many little perspectives and axonometrics and such that are moving around the edge of the drawing. Literally, you can tell that the drawing is being rotated on the page or on the table, so that because they're all oriented in different ways. And these are generally at the building site. Again, because there are nothing that we would normally call. He did the basic drawings that were required for getting a permit, which was not particularly well developed. It was just rather skeletal. For all his projects, but after that, it was he lived in Verona, or was there 4 days a week for the time that he was working on the bank. So he was as close to being on site as possible, and also, as you saw, also in the building, in the shops where they made the metalwork and the woodwork and the other things. And these drawings, in the end, the drawings, there's layers and layers of information on the drawings, but the drawings are really about the production of the work. And I argue, if you go to the Scarpa archives, they themselves are kind of artifacts. I think they're beautiful enough that one would wish to sort of display them as art, but I think they're much more interesting to see as the group of drawings, because it gives you a really different sense of how a building might come into be, and what would be the way that the discussion goes between the craftsperson and the architect. When the architect is asked a question, the first thing they do is to begin to draw a small diagram, and then the builder says, yes, okay, I can do that, or maybe how do we fit that piece into this piece? And mock-ups were made many times, particularly of the metalwork and other things, so that they would be able to make sure that it could fit together and it could somehow be cast into the concrete. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but he does use drawings in a dramatically different way. And I do believe the statement I read at the end, he does believe that he can't see it unless he draws it. And of course, this is parallel to a statement that Corbusier made, that, you know, you need to, if you go visit places, you have to draw them, and you take them sort of into yourself. When you draw them, you make them your own. And this notion of the drawing as not a sort of abstracted or sort of distant activity or sort of professional activity. It's really a manner of grappling with and translating what you're trying to do from one thought into another thought. So, but I could look for an hour or 2 hours just to sit and look at the drawings. They're incredible.
I will allow anyone to unmute themselves also if they want to ask a question, or if you want to put them on the. I have a question, Robert, while we're getting some more on the chat box, but I see like in Scarpa's exhibitions that his work is like so sophisticated in the sense of the choreography he puts together with the rooms, with the art pieces, with the windows as a very important element, and also light moving and the viewer. So he plays with the static and the dynamic. And some of those spaces almost glow like glass, right? Like his glass works. So I wonder about his process with drawings. Was he ever working in, and you mentioned mock-ups, but was he ever working in models or any kind of, or solely in drawing?
Well, we don't have too many models left, so it's a little hard, and there's not too many photographs of models. And I think he, as far as I can tell, he was working almost exclusively in drawings. Also because I don't think he liked the fixedness of. I mean, that's why he never actually did what we would call a working drawing, because I think he believed that he had to continue to work on it. And once the construction started, he discovered all sorts of things in the process, which is, of course, typical, but unfortunately nowadays very difficult for architects to take advantage of the discoveries that we make during construction. Frank Lloyd Wright used to cut holes in some of his buildings because he thought he needed more light, but that's a little difficult to do these days. But even, he couldn't see it. So going back and forth from the drawings to the building, but for Scarpa, the drawing is never an abstract, beautiful thing. He's drawing materials, he's drawing connections, he's drawing joints, he's thinking three-dimensionally, and a lot of the drawings tend to be axiometrics and other things. So, but I haven't, I mean, there have been models made of his buildings, of course, afterwards, but I'm things that would come from his office, doubtful about his own work. I mean, he might have built some models of other things, but I didn't ever have the privilege of knowing him or working with him, which is one of the things that I share with most of the people I work with, except the architects who are still with us. But I think that the drawing was tied up in the construction in a way that's very hard for us to understand, because we see these steps in the process, but I don't think he thought of it that way. I think that everything could be changed at a moment, and the drawing is about communicating this to another person, or also communicating to yourself of what it could be. But I don't think he ever used a color, and he never used a shape that wasn't somehow conceived about what material it would be made out of. Including concrete. He's doing things to concrete, like these steps that are slightly crazy, but he's giving concrete a certain character that is very different from the way other people use concrete. And so to me, the drawings are the key. That's why I show so many of them. But you have to imagine these drawings literally being out on the job site. And some of them are a mess. When you go see them, they're quite dirty, and they've obviously been around. They haven't just been sitting in a nice, clean office. They've been out on the job site, sitting on top of concrete and being drawn on. And you see things on the back sides of the drawings as well as the front sides.
Yes, we have a comment by Paul Dennehy, who says that the drawings show multiple hands in their layered execution. We have a question by Constance Vale. Maybe she can ask it herself, if you prefer, Constance.
I can. Thank you, Robert, for a wonderfully detailed and intricate lecture. What are the ways in which Scarpa informs your teaching, either through interfacing with his work directly in previous studios, or through a specific assignment that might relate back to his kind of process of representation, or working with art as a sort of source of feedback or information, anything to that end?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, right now I'm teaching a studio that has to do with Venice, and has to do with Le Corbusier's hospital in Venice. But I think it's very important that, and my students are here tonight, that somehow this this amazing place of Venice, which Scarpa had the privilege of spending his whole career in. And so everything that he does is somehow defined by Venice. And of course, Corbusier came and worked in Venice, and he did a building there that perhaps was different from anything else. And as is true of Kahn's building in some ways, though I think Kahn's building is, it's also something that could only happen in Venice. But so I'm not sure. I do enjoy the idea of giving students occasionally the chance to design a space for a set group of art pieces. If I do a museum, I have done museum projects where the museum is for a specific artist, and so I can give, say, 9 paintings by that artist, and then the students take a sort of notion of what's the proper space for this particular artist, which is a little bit something that Scarpa took for granted, because again, if you count the number of projects he did, the vast majority of them are relatively temporary art installations for the Biennale and other, well, all over Italy and all over the world. But that was just his mode of operation. I don't know how much interest he would have in designing a generic museum. Like when Kahn was first asked to hire to do the Kimball, not totally sure, because the Kimball didn't really have a collection. And in fact, it was presented to Kahn as it should be a kind of generic, just kind of perfect place for art, whatever that is. And of course, I think it is. But I just don't know if Scarpa would have any way to grapple with that, because for him, he would sit for hours in front of these paintings and not making any drawings for a long time. And then he would eventually make small drawings trying to understand. He would look at the paintings in whatever position they were in right now, but then he would, and you see photographs of him just sitting there looking at these paintings. So I think one of the things that makes great architecture, frankly, is looking long and hard. And he did that, but he didn't just do it in terms of a building. He did it also in terms of the installation or the moment or the conversation that he hoped people would have with certain paintings. And so that's very hard to work into a ridiculously short studio project, because he's basically spending his life doing this stuff. But I do think that it's impossible to think about working in Venice without at least understanding, if you don't, I don't think you have to be necessarily sort of literally formally inspired by, but I think you have to understand what Scarpa was doing and why he did it that way and how Venetian that is. I think a lot of the work that came after Scarpa was unfortunately very much copying his forms. And you see the Vesica Pisces, you see the double circles, but I don't think that's the point. I think that was his own particular sort of pivot to understand how to invent forms. But I think you miss something if you think that's what it is that makes a Scarpa building. Because unfortunately now, if you go to the Veneto, you will see some things that, are clearly a little bit of a riff on Scarpa. But I think that misses the point entirely, because you should be doing what it is that you're doing now, 50 years later, which is about now and how now fits into Venice. And how we add today should be different from the way he added in the 70s or the 60s. So I think what Scarpa helps me do and helps students do is just to really slow down and realize that the world is a much more complicated place than we think, and that contextualism is not as easy as we like to think. And it involves a huge personal investment that I think most of the time we just would prefer to find some kind of formula and say, oh yeah, well now I've been contextual, I did what I needed to do. But I think it's much deeper, and of course he has the benefit, which I don't have, of being a Venetian and being embedded in that culture, which is going deeply back in time. So I suppose I'm a spectator, you could say, but so I do structure projects to try to set up the idea that maybe it's worth occasionally taking the time to do these things and to imagine a different way of engaging art, or a different way of engaging craft or a place. Because I think any program can lead to that kind of depth. And you could say, in a beautiful way, Scarpa was very limited, but I think that was one of the reasons he's so powerful is, he didn't try to do everything. I mean, he took the commissions that came, but somehow he made each of those commissions into his building, into a building that responded to its context in his particular way. So.
Thank you, Robert. I
Right.
think we have another question by Robert Kahn. Maybe Robert. Hi, Robert.
Kahn, yes.
Maybe you want to ask it yourself.
Yeah, I have a question. First of all, well done. Thank you. Bravo. I have a question and a comment. The question is, can you imagine Scarpa having been Scarpa if he was trained on a computer as a young man to draw? And my comment is, I would have appreciated you setting the bar just a little bit lower for me.
That is a reference to the fact that he's lecturing here shortly. I'm going to introduce you too, by the way. So I'll be doing what Monica's doing for me when you talk about James Sterling, which I'm very much looking forward to. But I don't really think, you know, I was reading a book not long ago that tried to suggest, you know, what would Frank Lloyd Wright be like if he had a computer? I really don't think it, I just don't see it. I think the computer, I don't use the computer, so I can't really answer this. My students could do a much better job. But I think that the notion of we as a contemporary person has to connect themselves to our time, to the future, and to the past. And Scarpa is incredibly good at this, because when you go into Scarpa's buildings, you don't ever confuse the old things for the new things. There are old things there and there are new things there. And you always understand the difference, and you understand this kind of relationship, but you also understand that they make something together that was completely different. He did it through drawing. I don't know that he would have been able to, he would have been a different person if he had some other medium of working. I think it's more of a rhetorical question, but I'll let it.
It was, yes.
I think James Sterling would probably not have done so well on the computer either. But because I think drawing, one of the things I try to emphasize to my students is, you know, when you look at Frank Lloyd Wright's drawings, I'm teaching a seminar on Frank Lloyd Wright, you know, the choice of a perspective was a serious business, because it took a long time to lay that damn perspective out. And so, you know, you would really think long and hard, exactly what is the viewpoint I want? How do I want to position the person in it? And Scarpa has the same, you could feel that in his drawings. He's laminating onto these floors and he's inhabiting them so that they feel almost as if they've been somehow occupied. His drawings look like some kind of ancient ruin. I mean, because they're so worked. They're so, you know, they have the marks that we expect to find in a building that has been inhabited for many years by a rich culture in this case as well. So not sure I answered your question, but
You did.
I can't stretch that far to figure out what Scarpa would have done with a computer, because if he was born in our time, he would be a different person, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I would hope he could find a way to do some of these things. Scarpa's attitude, though, was very modest. I mean, that's why I read that quote, you know, that all existing buildings are my métier. I mean, that's a pretty powerful statement for any architect to say, frankly. I don't think any architect practicing today can say that. But he did, and in his case, it was the whole of the Veneto that he was taken on, because that's what he felt was his territory to work in. And when he worked in Zurich, or when he worked in Bologna or other cities, he still took the same attitude. He tried to understand those cities and tap into their culture. Obviously not as deeply as he could in Venice, but just think about that. All the buildings, all the historical buildings are my métier. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
I think those. Yes, no, I think those are great words, and maybe to wrap up the lecture, it's almost 8, unless
yes,
there's. I see there's one. I don't know if there's any. I don't see any. I see some hands raised, so maybe.
I'm raising a hand, but I can't.
Yes.
Am I on?
Yes.
Yes. We'll take this last question. Thank you.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between Scarpa and Louis Kahn, and what you know about it, and what the influences might have been between the two men.
Ooh. Well, having written very large books on both men, and I'm in the middle of actually redoing my Kahn book. It's kind of come out as a second edition. I think they respected each other very much. I think at least his wife Esther thought it was really important that the very last thing, he didn't write very much. Kahn. He spoke a lot, and then sometimes things were written down, but he would write in his notebooks, but that wasn't really for anybody but him. But the last thing he formally wrote, which he did very rarely, was this small poem that I read, which is for a book of Scarpa's work. And again, he spent a lot of time with Scarpa when he was working on the project in Venice. Though I don't think Scarpa was formally associated with the project. Venice is a complicated place and everybody's related to everybody, but Scarpa was neither the client nor the local architect, really. He was a kind of advisor, where he was more, you could say, more formally involved with Frank Lloyd Wright when Wright was there because Mazzieri was a former student of his. On the other hand, you know, opposites attract, I suppose. I mean, they're very different. Yeah. They both love the joint, but I think they came to the idea of the joint from very different directions. For Kahn, the joint was a kind of expression of the logic of the building taken to the highest level, the kind of how you make it taken to the highest level. I think for Scarpa, I haven't really ever said this exactly this way before, I think Scarpa, the joint, is a way to root the building into its place. And it's about the making, but it's also about somehow making it be here. And it can't be anywhere else. And so there are repeating shapes, but he never repeats certain things. And everything is always adjusted. So the building in Verona, you know, superficially you say, oh, well, of course it's like the ones in Venice. It's not. Every single thing about it is a little bit different, but it's also still in the Veneto. So it's not in another world, so to speak. It's still part of the same culture. But I don't think they spent a huge amount of time together, and they weren't formally engaged in being a project architect or whatever the case may be. But Kahn was someone who desperately wanted to learn about the places where he worked. And you couldn't ask for a better person than Scarpa to introduce you to what's the essence of the Venetian culture, at least seen from the point of view of a modern architect. I can't even imagine anybody who would do better, because you had people like Bruno Zevi and you had people like some of the other faculty, but they're working, you could even argue, in a slightly larger, you know, they're working in an Italian atmosphere, whereas Scarpa is just Venetian, and that's all he is. And that's all he wanted to be, because that was a big enough world for him. So I think there was mutual admiration. Clearly, you can find Kahn, you can find some, you know, Kahn, we're finding out all sorts of things about Kahn these days, as well as Scarpa. You can find Kahn making a little bit funny comments about, oh, this guy has a lot of details, you know, he really has a lot of details, which of course, you know, would have been maybe overwhelmed Kahn a little bit because of Kahn's, you know, in the end, Kahn has a real sort of quiet, powerful, understated vocabulary, and Scarpa appears to be something quite different until you really understand how the buildings work. I think the other question is, how many of Scarpa's buildings was Kahn able to visit? I do think he went to Cornice Stampaglia, but I don't know where else he might have been able to go. And I personally don't believe that you can understand Scarpa without visiting his buildings. You know, I'm glad people read my book, but I just, you have to be in Venice and you have to be in his buildings, both. And
it starts with a bridge.
Hmm?
It starts with a bridge.
It starts with a bridge, that's right.
The bridge.
The bridge.
To enter.
Yes, yes, the Cornice Stampaglia, yes.
It's made this way.
Yes.
Everything is there.
Okay, I want to introduce everyone to José Upéry, the partner of Le Corbusier, who worked also on the hospital and other.
Not a partner.
You were a partner in the beginning, and then
yes.
And successor. And
I made myself a partner.
Good to see you, Jose. Good to see you. Are you in Kentucky? Are you in Kentucky now, yeah. Right? Lexington, yeah?
Yeah.
Ah, very good, very good. You were in Chicago for a while, but.
So I just wanted to ask you, I was lecturing in Trieste, and I discovered that Scarpa did the addition to a renovation of a building of the museum, and he built on the top even another piece of building. And if you want, I cannot send it to you now, but I could.
No, in Trieste, right?
Yeah.
Trieste. Yeah, but that was not finished until after he died. So there,
Yeah, it's a little bit.
yeah, he did some drawings. There are actually 3 buildings. There's a bank, there's that museum addition, and there's another one. All of them finished. They were all finished after he died. And unfortunately, and that includes also the gate that goes to the university. That was also finished after he died. And I just, you know, it's a little bit like some of these buildings that Frank Lloyd Wright's that get finished after he's died. They're not quite right, so to speak. Not everyone is lucky enough to have someone like you to do the Fermini Church that Le Corbusier was able to have someone carry the project literally like that.
Yeah, it was, but I had the chance to meet Scarpa.
Yes.
And my own main question about him is, and all the drawings, is how they could build with that. So that means that he was, if I am correct, do you remember Mazzariol, Giuseppe Mazzariol?
Yes.
He was the main actor in bringing Wright, Kahn, and Corbusier to Venice. Was a professor of history at the university. And one day he told me that Scarpa, for example, when they did the Cornice Campania, Mazzariol was waiting and waiting and waiting. So one day he bought some workers and he called Scarpa. And Scarpa was hearing a noise of destruction of everything. And Scarpa said, "What is that?" And Mazzariol said, "Well, I don't know my project, you know, so we started to make some work." "What? You stop immediately?" Blah, blah, blah. And you took a 2-bedroom in an hotel close to the Querini.
Yes.
One, empty it, put table to draw, and he was generally drawing with 1 person or 2, no more.
Yep.
And he started to make the drawings and so on. I mean, I like this, you know, you had a question before about the technology that we have, which is fantastic. I do not use computer too. Maybe that's the last generation of idiots, but I don't know. But I don't see you could make what Scarpa did, you know, or Corbusier or Kahn or Wright with computers, because it's a process of working. It's very different. You know, it's so I don't say that this to say you cannot work with computer, but I say if you work with computer, you have to define a complete new way of working. Okay, and I have a last story about, if you have permit, about Scarpa.
Yes, please.
Scarpa was mad in Venice about the people repainting the building with a kind of paint color of the, you know, in Venice, the walls, it was a mortar which was colored.
Yeah, stucco, colored stucco, yes.
Yeah, there is a famous story of when one day in the church, in the big church of on the side, they were renovating. There's a lot of stories about renovation, it was a pure bullshit. But one day Scarpa passed in front of her and he see the guy, you know, painting. And he started and he said, "Arcivescovo, cretino!" And he stopped, and all the city was, and that was his reaction to fight against, you know, the destruction of the authenticity of the building.
Right, because what makes the Venetian plaster so important is it's integral. The color is inside the plaster, whether it's a rough plaster or not. That's why I was mentioning on the bank, he uses a plaster where he puts the terracotta dust, goes into the plaster to give it the color and the particular texture. And so paint is not a good thing. Plus, it doesn't last in Venice. The paint never lasts, so it's a waste of time. So,
Great. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you everyone for participating. It was nice to have this discussion at the end. So thank you for coming and joining us, and thank you, Robert, for the great lecture. So
thank you
see
for hosting, and thank you all for coming. I think I saw everyone. But anyway, thank you very much, and I appreciate your patience.
Thanks for the students who turning on their video now to say bye. That's a nice detail, so appreciate it.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Jose.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Mr. Cole, goodbye. Yes, Robert, hey, goodbye, see you. There's too many screens worth of people here, yes. So, thanks you guys all, especially you coming from a long ways away from other places. So thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Monica, thank you very much, Monica. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye, Robert Cole.
Hey.